Hello, EDU 304, and welcome to what is our first online module in the assessment and evaluation class. It's going to be focused on homework today. And so my hope is that this brief module will serve as a nice self-contained short introduction to what online learning might look like moving forward. And so I anticipate there's some anxiety out there. I want you to just calm yourselves. We will get through this together. And I think that this will be a nice way to just sort of gauge the temperature of the water, so to speak, and what this is all going to look like. And so our first module in EDU 304 is going to be centered on homework. I pull up this next screen and I had to share this picture of Jonah, one of my boys, with you. And by the way, that is pudding that's all over him. But I feel like sometimes when I wake up and I come to work and I'm trying to move classes online, that this is the mess that I'm living in, right? And maybe you can relate to some of that, just in terms of how your lives have been sort of shaken upside down. You don't necessarily know what the future looks like as far as this coronavirus and COVID-19 and the containment and all those sorts of things. But I try to give a little bit of levity and humor here. What I want to do is I want to turn your attention over to the syllabus addendum, as I've called it, or the transition schedule to moving online. And this was attached to the email that I sent to you. It's also available for download on the EDU 304 page of my USF. Module 1 is focused on diversity and homework. In addition to this video lecture, I would encourage you to go ahead and access Enneagram number 8. Believe it or not, number 8 is actually the first Enneagram video. And then you'll be able to download the note sheets and go through that as well, because that Enneagram module is going to be happening simultaneously as we move through the other 5 assessment modules. But your only assignment here for this first day of class is the diversity in homework reflection, which is due to my USF. You'll just upload that by 11:55 p.m. on March 29th. But what I'd like to do is to access that really quickly and just kind of give you a brief overview of what I'm asking you to do. Following our lesson and our lecture today, I'm going to ask you to complete something that's very similar to the template that I gave you for diversity in grading, but I'm asking you to create a defensive argument to persuade parents, students, administrators that your classroom homework policy is fair and equitable to all. So begin by stating your claim and providing evidence via quotations from either the articles that I've given to you in the past, the article that I've uploaded under Module 1, the textbook could be another great source of textual evidence for quotations. And then be sure to discuss your homework, late, and zero policy, providing evidence and reasons for your practice. So similar to the diversity in grading assignment, I ask you to begin by giving me your name, a hypothetical grade level that you're teaching, a hypothetical content area, and then to go ahead and to give me what I'm anticipating is about 2 paragraphs worth of exposition on your homework policy. One note that I want to make clear is that for some of you, you might be anticipating teaching a kindergarten or first grade classroom where the homework is going to, by nature, be very, very limited. Let me remind you that your teaching certificate will actually be K through 8th grade. And so by nature of that, I'm asking you to, if you're going to be in the elementary classroom, let's move to the higher level of elementary where you're going to actually have to come up with a homework policy. In other words, what I want to avoid is you saying, oh, I'm going to teach kindergarten, there will be no homework, that's my policy. That would not be acceptable for this assignment. So I just wanted to make that clear as we begin here today. All right, the question that I ask you, rather the question that students may ask you moving forward in your role as a professional teacher is this. and I've heard it many times. Mr. Berg, why do you keep asking for my homework? I never have it done. I don't think I ever will. In other words, why do you keep on nagging me about where's my assignment, or why am I not turning it in, and why am I not getting it done? And the answer is always the same. I didn't do it. I forgot. I don't care. Okay. That's the question I want us to consider as we move forward here in today's lesson. And so what I'm going to ask you to do before we go any further is to go ahead and pause this lecture and either access the document, The Case Against Homework, over on the right-hand side where the downloads and uploads are for Module 1, or just go ahead and bear with me while I access that. And what you could do is you could just actually pause the video if you wanted to and read it on screen here. So I'll go ahead and give you that first section. Here's the second section. Again, you can pause if you want to read it on the screen here. And then I'll go to the third and final section. And my hope is that article by Alfie Kohn can sort of guide us and lead us as we move into our discussion here today. The final thing that I want to pull up for you, or ask you to pull up, is the homework graphic organizer. I'm going to ask you to actually upload this onto my USF, and this is kind of how I'm going to take attendance today, just seeing that you have all completed it and uploaded it. And so go ahead and just download that Word document over on the right-hand side. And then as we move through today's lesson, just fill in the blanks to the best of your ability, jot down any other notes that might be helpful to you. All right. I'm assuming, based on the conversations that we've had throughout the past 4 to 6 weeks as we've gotten to know each other, that most of you come from K-12 contexts where homework was a part of your daily life, especially in the secondary classroom, middle school and high school classrooms, right? In some cases, it was homework that you would have every single night. In other cases, it might have just been on certain occasions. The question that I want you to grapple with a little bit before we get into the sort of the meat of this lecture is, what is the purpose of homework? Think about this in your experience as a student in K-12 education. And then also as your experience now as a pre-professional teacher. What was the purpose of homework when you were a student in your mind, and what will be the purpose of homework in your classroom for your students moving forward? Is the purpose, excuse me, the purpose of homework a measure of student learning? In other words, is it a gauge, is it an assessment format that allows you to better understand where your students are at academically? Is or was the purpose of homework in your life a motivational tool to get students to pay attention, to get students to interact with the work, to get the homework done because it's a part of their grade or whatever the case might be? Is the purpose of homework to make your students' lives miserable? Certainly that's not the case from a teacher's perspective, at least I hope that's not the case. But from a student's perspective, maybe that is. They don't see the value of homework or the purpose of homework. And so really all that it appears to them is just a way to keep them from what they really want to be doing after they get out of school for 8 hours. They finally get home and they can hang out with their friends, they can play video games, they can do whatever. Maybe they have chores to do, but they see this as another way to make their lives miserable. Maybe this is the way that you are viewing homework, maybe even for my course, EDU 304, as we speak. I think what's important as we move forward is that we assess the purpose of our homework and our homework policies and procedures. Now, this is not going to be a rant saying, never give homework. Okay, by nature, this lesson is designed to bring out some of the negative aspects of homework. I mean, take a look at the heading here. What are some problems with the traditional homework approach? But I fully recognize that there are circumstances and situations where homework is important. It's important to student learning and development. It's important for you as a teacher to make sure that students are where you need them to be. I think the most important thing to keep in mind as we move forward is that for years and years and years, in my experience, homework policies have been based more upon tradition. This is the way we've kind of always done it, rather than on research and upon the true needs of students and teachers. And so what I hope to do as we move through the graphic organizer and I move through the slides here in the remainder of this lesson is to grapple with intellectually a little bit some problems that might arise with our traditional homework approaches. Fully recognizing that there is no black or white thinking on this. At least there shouldn't be in the minds of a good educator. It's not that homework is always right in all circumstances or always wrong and should never be used. Rather, there's this sort of mix of gray, this sort of complex space where in some cases homework is beneficial and in others it isn't. So problem number one, and the text brings this to light when it talks about problems with the traditional homework approach. Grading homework confuses completion with understanding. Or I guess I should say that it could confuse completion with understanding. So that would be the first two blanks in your graphic organizer as you're following along. Two quotes from Dweck in the textbook. Attaching a grade to homework inevitably leads to grading completion rather than understanding. And secondly, the issue is not the value of hard work, but rather the manner in which it is represented. And so I just want you to pause and think about this for a moment. When we're asking our students to do homework, and then they're handing in that homework or they're submitting it online like you are right now for this class, how are we going about grading that? When we grade that homework, are we just grading based on completion? They've gone through and they've filled in every blank on the graphic organizer. They've given us some sort of answer to the math problem. Or are we actually grading it based on understanding and trying to gauge what students understand and what they don't? I think we've probably all been in situations where you've completed some homework, you've handed in the worksheet, and then you've gotten the A, or maybe it hasn't been graded, but you've been graded just because you've completed it, just because you wrote something down. And I would argue that that is one of the problems with a traditional homework approach that we want to try to avoid, because what we're doing when we're grading the completion is we're grading a behavior rather than necessarily grading the student's learning. And we want to be careful about how we represent behaviors in our gradebook. If we have a category, if we have a standard, if we have a place where we are able to grade student behavior and it's represented as that, then that's fine. Let's communicate that to parents and students. But if we don't, and we're working in a traditional grading paradigm where everything is being averaged and we're spitting out one percentage, a 95%, and we're calling that an A, I don't know that it's equitable or fair for us to be grading a student's behavior when what in fact that grade is supposed to represent is a student's learning. And so we want to be careful as we proceed with homework that really what we're measuring is the student's learning. So the natural question that arises is, what if a student doesn't complete the homework but has mastered the learning? Should they be docked points because they know what they're supposed to know and they just didn't do the work to sort of show you that via the homework? And I bring this up because this is a question that parents and students themselves in some cases might raise. The second problem with traditional homework, or grading homework, I guess I should say, is that by grading homework, we're promoting busy work at the expense of intrinsic motivation and authentic learning from students. And so the text says there's a mismatch between what science knows and what schools do. Schools are redoubling their emphasis on routines, right answers, and standardization, bribing students, in a sense, into compliance instead of challenging them into engagement. And so this is kind of a tough situation to be in, where as educators, we want to intrinsically motivate our students. And by constantly forcing them to complete something, and oftentimes homework is at the lowest level of Bloom's taxonomy, and it's just sort of this rote memorization type of thing, or fill in the blank like you're experiencing right now, we're not necessarily motivating our students intrinsically or allowing them to authentically show their understanding via projects or real-world experiments or those types of things. The third problem is that grading homework results in inflated grades and oftentimes cheating. Hardworking students get extra marks through completing homework, but they're not necessarily deepening their understanding because, like I just mentioned, homework is typically assigned and assessed at a very low level of Bloom's or Webb understanding. Homework really acts as a grading cushion for many students, especially the hardworking ones, because they're getting all the homework done. And so what that's doing is that's artificially inflating their grade, and it's also creating an environment where cheating is something that students may desire to do. One study that I pulled suggests that nearly 70% of U.S. high school students admitted to cheating on at least one exam during the previous year. Now, if you take a look at that study, you note that 2005 was prior to the online explosion. In 2005, we didn't have students sitting in our classrooms with supercomputers in their pockets in the form of smartphones. And so the question when it comes to homework and it comes to grading homework and using that to cushion or to harm a student's grade is, you got to ask yourself, who is really doing the work? Is the student mentally working through the process? That's our hope. But how do you know it's the student and it's not Google, or it's not mom or dad or the neighbor that they're riding to school on the bus next to? The fourth problem with the traditional approach is that grading homework results in deflated grades and disillusion. Okay, so research suggests that struggling learners can expect to see the greatest academic gains when their teachers adopt a non-traditional grading method, meaning we're not necessarily going to grade homework. Why is that? Because when we have students who don't typically do the homework, they're not handing in the homework, they're not getting credit for the homework, and that's further harming their grades. They're already at a risk of failure, and then when we grade homework that they're not completing, that homework is further moving them down the grade chart. Okay? And that's not motivating to these students, that's actually disillusioning these students. We don't always know why students aren't completing the assignments. This is a battle that we're struggling with right now as this corona epidemic is hitting K-12 schools. We want to move all of our learning online, but what do we do with those students who are living in poverty, who literally do not have internet connectivity? They're not able to complete the work. So is it equitable, is it fair, is it right to give them a lower grade for not completing the homework they're unable to do? And that is a question that we have to grapple with. Struggling learners who face many obstacles to success in the classroom, outside of the classroom, plus punitive homework grades is what Dweck refers to as double jeopardy. Students are being harmed twice for this inability to complete the homework assignments. The incomplete homework of at-risk learners is probably more reflective of the sparse supports these students tend to have outside of school than anything else. Number 5, grading homework perpetuates extrinsic dependency. What does that mean? Well, students have been trained in our traditional K-12 environment to expect a grade for every assignment that they complete. That would include homework assignments. And so one teacher says that I thought I could use marks or grades to motivate student behavior. The problem was that the students who cared about the marks were not the ones I needed to worry about. In other words, the students who were motivated to do the homework because it increased their grade were not the students that the teacher was worrying about not handing in their homework. In other words, the students who are not handing in the homework are not motivated by saying, I'm going to grade this. Okay? But what do we mean by perpetuating extrinsic dependency? When students are in your class and everything that you ask them to do, they feel like there needs to be a grade attached to it, that really limits your freedom, it limits creativity, and it actually perpetuates this sort of inequitable grading scheme in which you feel obligated to put every assignment into the grade book, even if some of them might not necessarily be worthwhile. And so students are receiving credit for every single one of those. We know in reality that there are some things you just need to do or learn or expose your students to that they don't necessarily need to earn credit for. And so we want to try to break down this reliance on extrinsic motivators. The goal is that our students would take ownership of the content we're teaching, whether it's math or art or science or reading or whatever, and that they would be motivated intrinsically to pursue and deepen more knowledge in that subject area without us sort of holding a grade over their head for everything we're asking them to do. So if students see that the homework is worthwhile, they will put in the time to finish it. If the homework seems trivial, most likely they won't. Finally, grading homework perpetuates the disadvantages faced by lower income students. The author notes that I stopped grading homework the day I found out that one of my students had to wait until her father came home from work so that she could stand out in the gravel driveway and use the headlights from his truck to complete her homework. Let's stop and think about that for a second. Now, I don't know the socioeconomic upbringing that all of you faced as K-12 students, but I would assume you did not have this severe of a circumstance. If we can keep this reality in mind, that this is the life that some of our students are living outside of the classroom, I think this is going to do a whole lot to persuade us to re-examine how we view homework and grading homework in our classrooms. Because we want to see our disadvantaged students succeed, and the minute they leave our classroom, we lose control over their ability to succeed. When students leave our classroom, some of them are going to homes where they have professional parents, they're going to get a warm meal, they're going to have a well-lit, quiet space to work on homework with support from their parents, and other students are going to go home to the opposite. They might not even know where home is. They might not have the materials and the resources and the support to get that homework done. They might not have, as Maslow says, their lower needs being met. Lower needs being things like shelter and food and a loving environment. And if those lower needs aren't being met, there's no way that they are going to make homework a priority in their life. When I read this story that the author gives to us, I was reminded of a similar situation that I experienced when I was teaching at Lincoln. I had been away from school for an early meeting at our district kind of headquarters. And I was leaving right around first period. So school would have begun, and I had a substitute for the first period or two. And I was driving downtown, and I saw one of my students, and he was walking, and it was a winter day. It was snowing out, and he was walking with just a hoodie on. He had his backpack on his back, and he was walking in the direction of the bus station. And he looked like he was headed to school. And in fact, I was able to recognize when he had gotten to school much later than I did, because I was driving straight there and he was getting on the bus. And what I realized is this was a student that I had in class that I asked that question at the beginning of this lesson over and over. Where is your homework? Why isn't it done? Don't you realize your grade is failing? And I constantly barraged him with these questions and this guilt for not getting these assignments done. And it took me viewing him from the comfort of my warm car, heading to school, and seeing him walking on the sidewalk, all on his own, in the dead of winter, with a hoodie on, trying to get to school, that I realized whatever his circumstances are at home, homework is not the priority. And that forced me to rethink my approach with that student. I wanted to share some facts and statistics with you about students living in poverty, because the realities are stunning, especially for those of us who have never lived in poverty. That students that live in poverty are more likely to live in a crowded home. Think about that in terms of homework. Do they have a quiet, safe space to get this work done? Students living in poverty inherit lower self-esteem. They own fewer books and they watch more TV than their peers. They inherit negative views of school, oftentimes because their parents or guardians were unsuccessful with the traditional schooling approach themselves. Students living in poverty have a 50% chance of dealing with eviction, utility disconnection, and lack of food. I know I can't speak for all of you, but growing up as a kid in Sioux Falls in a middle income bracket, I never had to worry in my K-12 years about any of those items. Our students do. Students growing up or living in poverty have mentally adapted to suboptimal living conditions. They are tardy and absent more frequently than their peers. They have more physical altercations more often than their peers, resulting in violence, and are more likely than their peers to experience physical punishment at home. A question that sort of ties into this and that I get quite frequently is, Berg, what about extra credit? Right? And I want you to think about this, because again, I know that there's kind of a negative tint to this lecture, but homework is not all negative. And the reality is that in certain circumstances, homework is going to be necessary. But what about extra credit? I want you to pause and reflect for a second about situations where extra credit might be acceptable to include in a student's final grade. And I want you to think about some situations where extra credit might be unacceptable to include in a student's final grade. I want to end today where we began, living in this messy circumstance that we do. And just remind you, I realize that I have an earlier draft of the transition schedule up here that only has one of your two assignments. And so I just encourage you to remember to upload your homework graphic organizer. That's what's not listed here in this version. That's my way of taking attendance for today. And then also a reminder to complete and upload your diversity and homework reflection by this Sunday, March 29th. Thank you, and I will see you again for Module 2 on Wednesday.